present you a new system, a new tool that should be able to support the use of existing exposure models recommended in REACH regulations. The name of the tool is TREXMO, and in further slides I will explain why that name. So at the beginning, just short introduction about exposure models, existing exposure models recommended by REACH regulations. So operational exposure models are developed for workplace and regulatory exposure assessment, and these models all they use determinants as descriptors of exposure factors that are present at some workplace. Those determinants are combined through mathematical equation in order to produce some models output or models prediction. So far we have a lot of different models already developed as RT, which is tier 2 model, so the most complex model in the REACH. Then Stoffer Manager Target Risk Assessment is MetalSys and EMKG Expo tool. These 6 models are further used in this study. In this table here, I want to show you that all these models are somehow different. So on the left side in the table, we can see that RT and Stoffer Merger as the most complex models use the most determinants to describe the some exposure scenario. Unlike the other 4 models on the right side, which use significantly less determinants to describe exposure for the exposure at some workplace. These 4 models that use which use less exposure determinants, when used, users should be more careful during selection of the appropriate exposure determinant for the considered exposure scenario. These models, in my opinion, can be more prone to wrong decision made by user. But that was the basic difference between these models. The next more deeper difference when we are talking about these 6 models is that even if we have the same determinant that has the same name, and for example vapor pressure as the determinant used to determine fugacity of liquids in these 6 models, even at this level, when we are talking about determinants used in these models, we have some differences. For example, in RT and Stoffer Merger, again, as the most complex models, they use different way to describe this determinant, and the way how they describe is the continuous scaling of the vapor pressure, and again, they are different from the other 4 models, which use predefined exposure inputs for this determinant. But again, there's another differences between these simple models. So, for example, EasyTalk has 4 predefined inputs vapor pressure range to define fugacity of liquids, unlike MES that uses 3 predefined inputs for the same determinant. This is the simple example of differences between these models. There are much more differences when we go to other determinants as activities or handling in Stoffer Manager and RT, which uses totally different way to describe activity applied to some source of exposure. All these require from the user to appropriately select the list of inputs for every determinant used in any of these models. But as I mentioned, as I explained in these 3 previous slides, all these models are different, and that is the one problem when these models are used. And on the other hand, we have users that are different as well. So they are coming from different industries, different jobs, and they have different experience in using these models. So mixed together, these two differences, these two problems lead to one consequence that these different users can describe the same exposure scenario within the same exposure model in different way. So we have different interpretation, and as the main consequence and the final consequence of these sources of problems are that we have a variety of results obtained for the same exposure scenario, just described, coded by different users in some of the models. Because of this, we started to develop a new system that should help user in the most appropriate way define his exposure scenario in these 6 models. This system interfaces the 6 most common used models, those models which I mentioned in the first slide. And in this system, user as usual, or assessor, interprets his exposure scenario report, code that scenario in one of the models. So in this system, he will be able to define, to give the list of all needed inputs for every determinant just in one of models, or he can use 2 or 3, but the main principle is that he can only define in one of the models, and where's my mouse? At this point, in a translation system, he will be able to get the appropriate analog exposure scenario with all analog exposure inputs for every determinant in some another model used in this tool. The goal of defining translation system between these 6 models is to increase consistency between users in the interpretation of different inputs and different, maybe I can name it different languages used in different models. As I said, this tool is based on the translations between models. So 6 models can communicate with each other, and these translations are developed in 3 steps. First, we reviewed all currently existing articles and technical guidelines related to these 6 models. We created something like a blueprint with all these inputs and determinants used in these 6 models. Then we researched compatibility between different inputs in different models in order to see where one of the inputs, for example, one of the inputs in one of the models can be used to represent the same exposure situation as some other exposure input in some other exposure model. Those inputs that can be used in the same exposure situations we named analog inputs or translations. These first 2 steps are finished so far, and the next step is to give all these tables with translations, suggested translations of analog inputs to experts in modeling, and to be reviewed by them. And then when we get agreement between those experts in modeling which will be participating in this step, defining of translations, we will finally be able to say that we have defined translations and definition system that can do translations between different inputs used in different exposure models. Here's one example what it actually means. This is the simple example. So, for example, if user enters value 1000 pascals in RRT in this system, he will to him will be suggested the most appropriate vapor pressure range used in other 5 models. This system will be able to work in opposite way, in a way that from lower level model, the given input can be translated in higher level model, but with much less efficiency because of complexity of given models. This is only the very simple example, but here's a more complex example, but this example should be much more useful. Sorry. Here we have a situation that we suggested translation from one activity class used in RT, fracture and abrasion wood, that is combined together with the underlying descriptor of activity in RT in order to suggest to the assessor what process category he should use in EasyDoc or metal seals and in Stoffer Manager. So, for example, if user gives codes activity class fracture and abrasion of wood in RT and underlying descriptor given by the user again is manual handling, this system suggests to the user to use to code process category 21 if he wants to get exposure prediction output from the EasyDoc model or metal seals. Of course, this was an ideal case when we have one exposure input and one analog exposure input suggested for use in another model. But in most of the cases, we didn't succeed to define something good as this. So, in most of the cases, we have for one of the exposure inputs used in RT or another model, more than one analog input in another model. So here for transport powders and granules activity class in RT, we successfully defined 5 process categories that can be used in EasyDoc when transfer powders as activity class is used in RT model. But anyway, this is still some kind of advantage because we limited user to be able to use only these 5 process categories, so he has not to choose anymore between 25 process categories, which is a significant reduction, and we can say that between user variability will be reduced when this translation system is applied. Here's the real example. When we took one exposure scenario report and we coded that report in RT, and we needed to supply RT with 11, to make 11 decisions in RT. Then, when we tried to code the same exposure scenario in 4 other models, here metal seals is excluded because for this model, exposure scenario report was not applicable. So, when we tried in other 4 models to represent the same exposure scenario, we needed to, what happened? We had to make in total 35 decisions. So you can imagine how many mistakes in coding can be made by common user which has who has very poor experience in using exposure models if he has to make in total 35 decisions in these 5 models. But when this previously defined system is used and user has this translation system predefined, then only by giving 11 exposure inputs in RT, he can obtain almost all exposure inputs, the most appropriate exposure inputs to be used in these 4 other models. So in total 11 decisions in RT and 2 more because RT cannot, RT doesn't have for all exposure inputs used in other models appropriate analog inputs in RT. So this means reduction, total reduction in input data needed to obtain appropriate exposure outputs from these 5 models in 63%, which is really good number. All this will be used further to test between user variability, between user variability when this system is used, translation system. So we will test 2 groups of assessors, of coders or users, doesn't matter. First group will be experts in modeling, and the second group will be industrial hygienists. We will give to them some couple of exposure scenario reports to code in these 6 models used in this study. From them we will collect set of coded exposure inputs and models outputs obtained for those scenarios from different users. Then in the second part of this test we will repeat the same test, but we will give to the users and tell to the users to use this predefined translation system. We will give them tables and the tool to use and to repeat the same test from the first part. Then coded scenario, set of inputs and models outputs produced in these 2 parts of the between user variability test, we will use for statistical analysis and test again between user variability, for how many percent we successfully reduced variability and what is the new variability of outputs coded by different users. And for conclusion, so we will see when we have different models because they are all different, and we have on the other side users with different level of knowledge and experience for using these models. We always can expect multitude of results and some variability for outputs and for making the decisions in selection the most appropriate set of inputs for these models. And because of that, we compared and we defined translation system that allows some set of exposure inputs defined in some of the models to be translated in the most appropriate set of inputs in another model. So this system named TREXMO, Translation Exposure Models, includes our test of merger, EasyTalk, MIS, MKG, and EASY. So this should reduce the amount of the data, probably reduce assessment time, and we will test in the further work how much we reduce between user variability with this TREXMO system, TREXMO tool. Thank you.